As the dawn breaks over the ancient city of Rome, a heavy shadow lies upon the empire that once ruled the known world. What was once a vast, unshakable dominion, stretching from the misty hills of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, now trembles on the brink of collapse. This is the final chapter. In part 1 of our Roman army trilogy, we followed the rise of Rome's earliest legions. Tribal militias hardened by war, forged in the crucible of conquest. In part 2, we watched as the Roman military transformed under Marius and marched beneath the eagle standards of empire, professional, disciplined, and relentless. But now, the march slows. In this final installment, we turn to the crumbling Western Empire, to a world of splintered loyalties, of emperors made and unmade in weeks, of brutal enemies pressing at every frontier. We follow the legions as they fight not for glory, but for survival. Not in faraway lands, but in the heart of Italy itself. This is the story of collapse, of the West's last stand and the Eastern Empire's uncertain rise. You'll hear the distant hooves of Hunnic riders, the songs of Gothic warbands, the prayers of Roman generals clinging to old gods or embracing new ones, and you'll walk through the quiet ruins of cities once mighty, now scorched by fire. So find a quiet place, let the soft crackle of firelight guide you, and drift gently into the twilight of an empire. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. If you enjoy what we do, this is what keeps the channel alive. Chapter 1: A Crumbling Frontier. As dawn broke over the riverbanks of the lower Danube in 376 CE, a bitter wind swept across the frost-crusted reeds. Sunlight shimmered off the dark waters, and from the surface, a veil of mist slowly began to rise, curling in the cold morning air. It drifted like breath from the land itself, quiet, steady, and full of tension. On the southern bank, Roman sentries stood motionless, their faces half buried in woolen cloaks, eyes locked on the far shore. There, across the river, an enormous host of Gothic refugees waited in silence. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air, mingling with the rising mist. Thousands stood together, fathers, warriors, women, children, each one staring southward, toward the empire they hoped might spare them. These were not strangers to Rome. Many had served within its armies. Some had bled for Roman causes. Others had stood as bodyguards in the very courts of Constantinople. But centuries earlier, their journey had begun far from this river. As current research and surviving traditions suggest, the Goths may have originated from a place known as Skansa, believed today to be Gotland, an island off the southeastern coast of modern-day Sweden. According to the 6th century Gothic historian Jordanes, their ancestors crossed the Baltic Sea during the 1st century CE and settled along the Vistula River, in what is now northern Poland. Here they formed part of the Vielbach culture, absorbing local customs and forging new identities. Over generations, they migrated southeast across the forested hills and open steppes of Ukraine and Romania, eventually reaching the northern shores of the Black Sea. By the 3rd century, Gothic power stretched from the Carpathians to the Pontic steppe. It was in this region, called Oyum in their traditions, that the Goths split into two great tribes, the Tervings, later known as the Visigoths, and the Gruthungs, ancestors of the Ostrogoths. Their society was mobile, decentralized, and shaped by both war and diplomacy. Some lived in wooden villages. Others ranged with horses across the plains. They traded with Romans and raided them too, depending on the season and the strength of the border. Then, a new terror arrived. From deep within the grasslands of what is now Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and southern Russia, the Huns descended, fierce nomadic horsemen who struck without warning. They leveled entire Gothic towns, shattered clans, and scattered tribes across the steppe. Facing destruction, the Gothic people, men, women, warriors, farmers fled westward en masse. Their goal, the river Danube. Beyond it lay the Eastern Roman Empire. And safety. At that time, the Eastern Empire was ruled by Valens, who governed from the city of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. His counterpart in the Western Empire was Gratian, a young emperor based in Mediolanum, now Milan, in northern Italy. Though they shared the imperial title, East and West were growing apart. Politics, distance, and mounting pressure at every border were straining unity. The armies were no longer what they had been. Defences were overstretched. And in the east, Valens found himself facing a decision no Roman emperor had encountered on this scale before. The Goths, desperate and scattered, had agreed to surrender their weapons in exchange for refuge. But corruption and confusion along the border meant that many crossed still armed, or quickly rearmed once inside. Their leaders expected food, shelter, and protection. Instead, they found chaos. Roman officials overseeing the relocation were corrupt and overwhelmed. Supplies were delayed or stolen. Food shipments rotted on the docks, while thousands starved along the banks. Some Gothic leaders offered gold or even their own sons as hostages in exchange for grain. Others were forced to accept dog meat and mouldy rations. Desperation turned quickly to rage. Within months, the balance shifted. The Goths, now inside Roman borders but treated like enemies, no longer saw Rome as a savior. They had tried diplomacy. They had waited. Now they would fight. And Rome, already stretched thin, was not ready. The legions had grown weaker in the east. Many border forts were abandoned or poorly manned. Armor was recycled, weapons in short supply. Recruitment had slowed, and morale was uncertain. The famed infrastructure, the roads, the signal towers, the command chains, still existed, but the pulse of power that once flowed through them was fading. Yet these Goths were not strangers in every sense. They had fought beside Romans, trained in Roman camps, marched under Roman generals. Some wore Roman armor. Some spoke Latin. In Constantinople, Gothic warriors had even served as imperial bodyguards. Their identities were tangled with the empire they now opposed. Their rebellion was not born out of hatred. It was forged from hunger, betrayal, and the need to survive. Now they occupied Thrace, a province that spans modern Bulgaria and European Turkey. Rome's own territory was becoming the battlefield. The Danube, once a clear border, had become a fracture line between past alliances and present chaos, between imperial control and the first cracks of collapse. And as the mist curled over the river that morning, it was already too late to turn back. The Goths pressed deeper into Thrace, moving not as scattered raiders, but as an organized tide of displaced families and hardened fighters. Roman soil trembled beneath the boots of tens of thousands. Smoke curled from burnt villas. Empty farmsteads dotted the hills. Roads, once humming with commerce and couriers, now lay shattered beneath the weight of wagons, oxen, and desperate feet. The very earth seemed to groan beneath the pressure. Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria, and European Turkey was not some forgotten borderland. It was a living artery of the empire. From its fields came grain for Constantinople. From its hills came timber and minerals. Now its villages stood hollow, walls charred black and barns broken open. Roman settlers had fled or been killed. Forts stood silent or fallen. It wasn't a siege. It was an unravelling. Behind the horizon, the Gothic host was not alone. Thousands of their women, children, and elders followed in wagons or on foot. These were not mercenaries seeking gold. They were a people displaced by fear and failure, cast out by Rome's betrayal at the Danube, and now caught in the desperate logic of survival. Each farm they claimed, each town they entered, was a step further from starvation and a step deeper into imperial heartland. Yet these Goths were not strangers in every sense. They had fought beside Romans, trained in Roman camps, marched under Roman generals. Some wore Roman armour. Some spoke Latin. In Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Gothic warriors had even served as imperial bodyguards. Their identities were tangled with the empire they now opposed. Their rebellion was not born out of hatred. It was forged from hunger, betrayal, and the need to survive. News of the invasion spread slowly, distorted by rumour and fear. Roman citizens in distant cities whispered of barbarians burning temples, slaughtering senators, toppling cities. In truth, the Gothic advance was erratic. Some towns were razed, others were spared. Roman soldiers, often outnumbered or poorly provisioned, dared not face them in open battle. The chain of command frayed. Local governors fled or sent frantic messengers to Constantinople, pleading for reinforcements. But the empire was sluggish. Valens, emperor of the East, governed from Antioch in modern-day Turkey. Far removed from the Danube crisis, he received only fragments of the truth, each filtered through layers of fear, politics, and imperial pride. He believed the Goths could still be brought to heel with a swift campaign. He delayed, and all the while the Gothic ranks swelled. Disparate bands, Tervings, Greuthungs, Huns, and others, gravitated towards the rebel corps. The Danube frontier had ruptured. The empire's enemies no longer stood beyond the river. They were here, on Roman land, drinking from Roman wells, and choosing which towns to spare and which to burn. Some Gothic warbands began forging weapons from Roman plowshares. Others captured old forts and repurposed them as outposts. They were learning, quickly. Rome had taught them discipline, armour, and war. Now those lessons returned, like echoes in the dark. And deeper still, among campfires and shattered columns, stories spread of emperors who could not be trusted, of Roman allies slain by their own generals, of treaties offered and broken. To many Goths, the empire was no longer a refuge but a cage, and now it was time to break it. As autumn drew near, Thrace became a wound in the Roman body, bleeding order, soldiers, and supplies. Yet few truly grasped what had begun. For most citizens across the empire, life still followed familiar rhythms. Markets opened, bells rang, aqueducts carried water. Rome remained the eternal city, untouched and unshaken. But in the forests of the Haemus Mountains and along the dusty roads near the Hebrus River, modern-day Maritza, a storm was gathering. A people betrayed had risen, and Rome, proud and vast, would soon face the consequences of its own failure. And through it all, the mist of the Danube lingered, curling like breath over a battlefield yet to be chosen. Chapter 2. The Emperor's Silence. The storm gathering over Thrace did not come with thunder. It came with silence. In the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, far from the smouldering hills of the Balkans, Emperor Valens sat in Antioch, modern-day Antakya, near the Mediterranean coast of southern Turkey. The air there was warm, scented with citrus groves and incense. Marble courtyards echoed with the sound of sandals, not screams. The polished mosaics beneath his feet showed triumphs, not defeat. And within the palace walls, Valens still believed he was in control. But the empire beneath him had begun to slip. Dispatches arrived late. When they did, they were cloaked in flattery or crippled by fear. Some were censored by provincial governors too afraid to admit the truth. Others were padded with optimistic lies from commanders desperate to keep their posts. The messages told of Gothic movements, but in vague terms, no urgent alarms, no calls for retreat. Valens, ruling from a distance, believed the situation was contained. He thought the Goths were restless, not rising. He believed he could crush them with a single decisive campaign. So he waited, and Rome, in his absence, bled. To understand this failure, we must understand the man. Flavius Julius Valens had not been born to rule. He was a soldier before he was a sovereign, elevated to power in 364 CE by his older brother Valentinian, who took the Western throne. The empire had been split in two, and Valens was given the East, a realm of ancient cities, vast plains, and constant pressures along the Danube. Unlike his brother, Valens lacked charisma. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply religious. A devout Arian Christian, he mistrusted pagans, Nicene Christians, and philosophers alike. He preferred loyalty over brilliance, stability over innovation. But this moment called for something else. By 377 CE, Thrace was no longer merely unstable. It was falling apart. Roads once watched by Roman patrols now bristled with Gothic scouts. Fortresses that had stood for decades now flew foreign banners. The provincial heartland was collapsing, but Valens hesitated. He believed he had more time. He believed Rome could afford to delay. He believed the problem could still be managed from afar. So he listened, to advisors who reassured him, to generals who downplayed the risk, to reports that diluted the truth. The chain of command, stretched thin across the Balkans, frayed further with every delay. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked. Governors once confident in Roman might now wrote with trembling hands, their words soaked in desperation. They spoke of burning towns, vanished cohorts, fields stripped bare. But their letters arrived too late, or were ignored entirely. Meanwhile, the Gothic advance accelerated. To the north, the Tervings, one of the two major Gothic factions, had formed the backbone of the migration. Led by Fritigern, a clever and pragmatic war leader, they moved with cohesion and discipline. Fritigern knew the terrain, he knew Roman tactics, and above all, he knew how slowly empires could move. He had seen the cracks in Roman bureaucracy firsthand. Years earlier, Fritigern had allied with the Romans against rival Gothic clans. He had fought for imperial favour, negotiated with governors, even dined with generals. He had witnessed the empire's splendour and its weaknesses. He knew how internal rivalries could stall decisions. He knew how commanders could be bought, how delays stacked upon delays. Now, with his people starving, and Rome's betrayal still fresh in their memories, Fritigern moved not as a barbarian, but as a strategist. And he wasn't alone. From the open plains north of the Haemus Mountains, a vast host of refugees and warriors followed the Terving column. Behind them came the Greutungs, another Gothic faction led by Alathius and Saphrax. These leaders, less diplomatic than Fritigern, had been forced into action by the same desperation. The Roman promise of safety, once extended to all Gothic peoples across the Danube, had collapsed. Thousands had drowned in the crossing. Others had been extorted by Roman officials, their children sold into slavery, their leaders humiliated. Now, vengeance walked with them, and in their shadows, another force stirred. Bands of Huns, nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, had begun to appear along the fringes. Some fought as allies to the Goths, others hunted stragglers and plundered the ruins they left behind. Their presence added fear to the flames. In Roman minds, the Goths were terrifying enough, but the Huns were the stuff of nightmares. Stories spoke of faces carved by wind and war, of warriors who drank from enemy skulls, of arrows that came without warning and never missed. Their reputation outpaced reality, but the fear was real. And fear now gripped the empire. In Constantinople, the people whispered. Caravans from the west arrived burned and broken. Refugees flooded into the capital's outskirts, bringing stories of slaughter and ruin. Temples offered prayers for peace. Senators debated who to blame. The city's elite began hoarding grain and gold. Though the city itself was not yet under threat, the shadow of war had reached its gates. And still, Valens did not come. He remained in Antioch, where fountains still bubbled and streets echoed with laughter. Some of his advisors urged caution, others begged for action, but the emperor hesitated. He feared making the wrong move. He feared that marching north would leave the east exposed to Persian aggression. He feared rebellion in his own ranks. And so he waited, while the fire spread. But Rome was not entirely silent. In Illyricum, modern-day Western Balkans, a general named Traianus attempted to muster a response. With a patchwork force of limitani, border troops, local militias, and whatever detachments could be spared, he tried to stem the Gothic advance. But his numbers were small, his weapons old, his supply lines fragile, and the Goths, with every passing week, grew stronger. By early 378 CE, Traianus had fallen back towards the city of Marcianople, near today's Devnya in Bulgaria. He requested reinforcements. None came. He pleaded for clearer orders. None arrived. Rome had not forgotten him. It had simply become paralyzed. And above it all, as Thrace buckled and broke, the emperor's silence lingered, like a curtain drawn over a burning stage. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were waiting. From the wind-blown plains of Thrace to the forested valleys of the Haemus Mountains, Roman soldiers clung to the edges of an unraveling frontier. Most had been stationed here long before the Danube crisis began, sent to defend the empire's border, not to survive its collapse. These were not the elite legions of imperial parades. They were the limitanae, frontier troops, underpaid, underfed, and often forgotten by the power centres of Antioch and Constantinople. Their forts, once symbols of Roman order, had become islands in a sea of uncertainty. Tower walls were cracked, armories half-stocked. Watchtowers stood in silence, their torches long cold. Supplies arrived late, if at all. Grain shipments meant for these garrisons had been stolen, misrouted, or destroyed in Gothic raids. And yet, the soldiers held their posts, out of duty, fear, habit, or the hope that help would come. They waited for orders that never arrived. Messages from generals were slow, often cryptic, or outright missing. Some fort commanders had resorted to lighting signal fires, hoping to communicate with neighbouring outposts like it was the early Republic. But even the hills refused to answer. Riders sent for news either vanished into the forest or returned with rumours, not strategy. One spoke of a massive Gothic warband moving south. Another claimed a Roman field army had been destroyed. Another still, that the emperor himself was mustering forces, but no one knew when or where. The men did what they could to prepare. In the barracks of frontier towns like Philippopolis and Serdica, modern-day Plovdiv and Sofia, they tightened what armour they had, checked their peeler for splinters, reforged broken swords using local blacksmiths and scrap iron. Helmets were patched with leather. Shields repainted with old unit emblems, half-worn, barely visible under years of grime and use. There was no official inspection, no rallying speech. Only frost on the stone walls, a whispering wind, and the knowledge that the enemy was close. They trained when they could, drilling formations on open fields or along dusty parade grounds. But many units were at half strength. Wounds from earlier skirmishes had gone untreated. Food was rationed to 1 meal a day. Some soldiers dug up turnips from abandoned farms or bartered with locals for goat meat, bread or wine. But the locals were growing scarce and suspicious. Roman authority was no longer feared in these lands. It was pitied. For every cohort that remained loyal, another had begun to break apart. Some deserters slipped into the countryside, hoping to vanish. Others turned to banditry. In a few tragic cases, Roman units, cut off and without support, surrendered to Gothic leaders in exchange for protection. It was not betrayal, it was survival. But not all had given up. A small number of field commanders still held fast, veterans of older campaigns, men who had fought in Armenia or Gaul, who remembered a time when Rome's name alone could clear roads and quiet rebellions. One such officer, Ricimer, a Frankish-born Roman general, had been assigned to Illyricum to support Trajanus. Ricimer worked tirelessly to coordinate what remained of the Roman response. He rode between camps, assessed supplies, rallied morale. But he too had few men and fewer answers. At night, campfires flickered along Roman ridgelines, faint, scattered stars of resistance. Soldiers shared stories of home, of better postings, of distant provinces untouched by war. In whispered voices, they debated whether the emperor would ever come. Some believed Valens was already dead. Others thought he had abandoned them. Others still believed he would arrive like thunder, with the full might of the East behind him. But belief was fading. By midsummer of 378 CE, scouts reported that Gothic warbands were drawing closer to the central plains. Villages near the Hebrus River, today's Maritza, were sacked. Roman watchtowers along the Via Militaris, the military road that once linked the Balkans to Constantinople, were found burned or empty. The Goths were moving deeper. They were no longer searching for safety. They were carving out territory. And the Roman soldiers left in their path were little more than obstacles. Some units attempted to intercept these movements, ambushing small Gothic bands or fortifying key crossroads. Skirmishes broke out in the foothills and forests, but the results were often bloody and inconclusive. The Goths fought with fierce desperation. Many wielded Roman weapons, taken from earlier battles or forged in looted towns. Their tactics, once primitive, had grown more precise. They struck quickly, retreated swiftly, and rarely allowed themselves to be drawn into full engagements. The Roman formations struggled to adapt. The manipular flexibility of the Republic was long gone. The heavy shield walls of the late Empire, anchored by discipline and numbers, worked best in open battlefields, not mountain passes and crumbling villages. Roman officers struggled to coordinate movements without a clear chain of command. Cavalry detachments were too few. Artillery, once a mainstay of Roman siege power, had not been brought this far inland. The legions were fighting a new kind of war with old tools, and they knew it. In one forgotten engagement near the ruins of Bero, modern-day Stara Zagora, a Roman unit of around 500 men was surrounded. They held a hilltop shrine for 3 days, using broken columns as barricades. On the 4th, their commander ordered a breakout. Less than 100 survived. Their story never reached Antioch. And still the soldiers waited. They stared towards the east, looking for banners on the horizon. They prayed to Mars, to Christ, to the old household gods of their childhood homes. Some carved messages into wood and stone, leaving behind names and warnings in places they knew they might not return to. Their bodies were weary, their minds worn thin, but they had not fled. They had not yet surrendered. They were the broken edge of empire, forgotten, scattered, but still Roman. Chapter 3. The Long March. It had taken months, too many months, but at last the empire began to move. In the spring of 378 CE, Emperor Valens finally rose from the marble halls of Antioch and set his sights north. The letters, rumours, and pleas from Thrace could no longer be dismissed. The reports were no longer veiled in flattery or softened by bureaucratic delay. Entire towns had fallen. Soldiers were deserting. Governors were dead or missing. The Gothic War had reached its 2nd year, and the Empire had not yet answered with its full strength. Now it would. Valens gathered what remained of his eastern forces. These were not ceremonial guards or palace favourites. They were hardened troops drawn from Syria, Palestine, and Asia Minor. Many had fought on Rome's eastern frontiers, against Arab tribes in the desert or Persian cavalry along the Euphrates. Some had not seen European soil in years. Now they were marching west, called to fight in a war they barely understood. The march was long, hot, and relentless. From Antioch, the army moved northwest, skirting the Anatolian plateau, crossing into Bithynia, then along the coast toward the Bosporus. It was a journey of weeks, then months. Soldiers trudged over dusty ridges, through pine forests, past ancient temples and towns where Roman banners still fluttered, though the news from Thrace had cast long shadows. The army crossed into Europe near Chalcedon, modern-day Kadıköy, then made its way through Constantinople. There, the people watched them pass with a strange mixture of awe and fear. For many citizens, it was the first time in years they had seen a full imperial army on the move. Rows of glinting helmets, leather-bound shields, iron-tipped spears rising like wheat stalks in motion. But there were gaps in the lines. Some units marched with fewer men than standard. Recruits filled spaces once held by veterans. The rhythm of Rome was still there, but quieter, older, and strained. From Constantinople, Valens led his men westward into the provinces of Thrace, into the same storm that had swallowed so many before him. He was not alone. In the west, his nephew and co-emperor Gratian had also begun to act. News of the Gothic uprising had reached him in Gaul, modern-day France, where he was fighting back Alemannic incursions along the Rhine. Gratian was younger than Valens, sharper in some ways, more popular with the army. He had only recently defeated a Germanic force near Argentoratum, now Strasbourg, and was eager to prove himself on a larger stage. Gratian ordered a second Roman army to head east under his command. These troops were fresh from the Rhine frontier, tough, disciplined, and battle-hardened. Their route was faster, sweeping southeast through Pannonia and into the Balkans. Gratian himself would follow, but not immediately. Sickness slowed his march, and the Danube crossings were made treacherous by late spring rains. Still, for the first time since the Goths crossed the Danube in 376, two emperors were now preparing for war. But coordination between them was flawed. Valens had always struggled to see Gratian as an equal. Though they ruled separate halves of the empire, Valens was older, more experienced, and felt entitled to the glory of victory. When word reached him that Gratian's army was approaching, he bristled. He did not want to wait. He did not want to share credit, and he feared that hesitation would be seen as weakness. So he pressed forward. Valens' army moved deeper into Thrace, past towns reduced to ashes, fields long abandoned, temples looted and defiled. The Roman countryside no longer looked Roman. Gone were the paved roads and neatly ploughed farms. In their place, ruins, overgrown paths, and silence broken only by the sound of distant crows. The army's morale was fragile. Many had never fought the Goths before. They had heard the stories, the burning towns, the vanished legions, the elusive warbands that seemed to disappear into the forests and hills like smoke. Commanders tried to keep order. Drills were resumed, marching columns were tightened, scouts were sent ahead. But discipline was brittle, and anxiety ran beneath every order. Valens established his forward base at Adrianople, modern-day Edirne. Once a thriving provincial city, it now sat heavy with fear. The Gothic army was said to be nearby, though no one knew exactly where. Some claimed they were hiding in the hills. Others said they were crossing rivers further west. Few agreed on anything, except that they were close. From Adrianople, Valens sent envoys to seek out Gothic leaders. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that negotiation was still possible. But Fritigern, the Gothic commander, answered with calculated silence. He had no reason to meet. He had the advantage. His warriors were rested, fed from the spoils of Roman farmland, and now knew the terrain better than most Roman scouts. Fritigern's army was not a ragtag band of migrants anymore. It was an organized force, hardened by 2 years of war, driven by survival, and unified by betrayal. His warriors had learned Roman discipline, some directly from Roman commanders. They had built their own fortifications, stockpiled weapons, and formed supply lines from captured towns. They had Roman captives among them, blacksmiths, engineers, even former soldiers. Fritigern was no longer fleeing Rome. He was challenging it. And Valens, in spite of everything, still believed he could win. He had roughly 15,000 to 20,000 troops under his command, fewer than he wanted, but more than many previous field armies. He hoped to meet the Gothic force in open battle, crush them swiftly, and return to Antioch with triumph in hand. He ignored those who urged caution. He ignored messengers who warned that Gratian's reinforcements were days away. He saw a chance to claim glory and restore Roman order with one decisive strike. But the land beneath his feet had changed, and the war ahead would not be the one he expected. The summer sun hung low over the plains of Thrace, painting the grasslands in tones of dry gold and grey dust. It had been weeks since Emperor Valens arrived in Adrianople. His army, camped in formation just south of the city, waited, uncertain whether the next day would bring battle, retreat, or diplomacy. The Roman soldiers dug trenches and raised wooden palisades, hammering stakes into the dry earth. Tents flapped in the hot wind. Armour was repaired, swords sharpened, waterskins filled. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and scorched grain. Scouts returned each night with conflicting reports. Fritigern's army was to the west, no, the north, or hiding in the foothills. It became clear that the Goths were not simply wandering, they were manoeuvring. Fritigern's strategy was simple and brutal: draw out the Romans, delay their reinforcements, and exploit their pride. His army, likely numbering in the tens of thousands, with many more non-combatants trailing behind, had learned to move like smoke across the land. Their camps were hidden in valleys, shielded by hills and wooded ravines. Campfires were minimized. Horses were kept tethered and quiet. Roman scouts rode in circles, chasing rumors. Inside the Roman camp, tempers frayed. Officers argued over whether to wait for Gratian or strike first. Valens listened but said little. He paced the command tents at night, reading reports by torchlight. He wanted a quick victory, clean and decisive. Yet every hour that passed without movement chipped away at that illusion. Food became a concern. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. Foraging parties returned with little more than weeds and stale grain. Water came from the Hebrus River, modern-day Maritza, but it ran low in summer, and the soldiers grew restless. Some had been marching for months. Their feet blistered, their backs ached, their discipline was stretched thin. The Gothic army, meanwhile, seemed to vanish. Fritigern used messengers, some Roman defectors, to send false reports, sowing confusion. He offered peace talks through intermediaries, asking for time, supplies, safe passage. It was a calculated ploy. Valens considered the proposal, briefly, then dismissed it. He believed the Goths were weak. He believed they feared a full Roman engagement, and above all, he believed they would flee if pressed. He was wrong. On the morning of August 8th, 378 CE, word came that Fritigern's forces had encamped a few miles north of Adrianople near a series of low hills. The news was both a relief and a temptation. Here was a chance to strike before Gratian arrived. Here was a chance for Valens to claim victory alone. That night, Roman troops prepared for battle. Torches burned late into the evening. Armor was checked one last time. Commanders gave quiet speeches. Veterans sharpened their blades in silence. Younger recruits knelt and prayed. The sounds of a restless army filled the air. Muffled orders, clanking metal, the soft shuffle of sandals across dirt. In the Gothic camp, preparations were more fluid. Warriors gathered into warbands, Turving cavalry, Greuthung foot soldiers, even some former Roman auxiliaries now turned against the empire. Fritigern kept his main force hidden behind ridges and in valleys. He sent a diplomatic party toward Adrianople again, offering negotiation, delay, anything that would keep the Romans uncertain. He knew exactly what he was doing. Fritigern wanted time for his cavalry, who were several miles away, to return and reinforce his infantry. The longer Valens hesitated, the more complete his trap became. And Valens, believing the Gothic army was disorganized, believed he had the upper hand. At dawn, the Roman army began to form up. Heavy infantry moved into columns. Archers prepared their quivers. Cavalry units formed the flanks. The sun rose behind them, hot and blinding. The order came to march. Thousands of soldiers, sweating beneath layers of metal and leather, moved out of the camp in silence. Their standards rose above the dust. Drums beat the rhythm. Valens remained behind briefly with his staff, confident this would be the beginning of a Roman triumph. They did not know the battlefield was already chosen. The hills where Fritigern waited offered perfect ground for defence and ambush. The Roman line, stretched and overheated, advanced slowly. The Gothic envoys rode out again, stalling for time, pretending to negotiate. Hours passed in the sun. Roman ranks wavered in the heat. Water was scarce. Still, Valens pushed forward. He did not yet know that Gothic cavalry, thousands of horsemen, were galloping back to the battlefield from the north. By midday, the Roman army had fully deployed, but the enemy remained motionless, waiting. The sun beat down. Shields grew too hot to hold. Men shifted their weight, eyes fixed on the ridgeline, and somewhere beyond that ridge, history was preparing to turn. Chapter 4. The Broken Alliance. As summer faded into autumn in the year 377 CE, the borderlands of Thrace, now mostly within modern-day Bulgaria, were not quiet. The Gothic refugees who had crossed the Danube a year earlier were no longer merely displaced. They had become something else, angry, armed, and desperate. At first, the Romans had seen their arrival as an opportunity. Emperor Valens in the east believed the Goths could be recruited, resettled, and used as loyal soldiers in the imperial ranks. That belief, once wrapped in the language of diplomacy and imperial charity, had crumbled into an ugly reality. Roman commanders had extorted the newcomers, demanding bribes in gold, livestock, or even the lives of Gothic children in exchange for food. Rations were scarce. Corruption was rampant, and the Goths, once willing to bow before Rome's authority, were now rising in fury. They began raiding the countryside, pillaging Roman granaries and waylaying supply caravans. Their leaders, Fritigern and Alavivus, once voices of negotiation, became wartime tacticians. In makeshift camps outside Roman cities, thousands of Gothic warriors trained in the dust and smoke, forging a new identity. No longer mere refugees, but a roaming, rebellious army. Inside the empire, the reaction was divided. In Constantinople, now the eastern capital of the Roman world and known today as Istanbul, panic spread. Valens's administration scrambled to raise troops, recalling frontier garrisons and conscripting local men. Across the Aegean Sea in Italy, Gratian, the co-emperor in the west, watched with growing concern. He had recently fought successful campaigns along the Rhine, and was only in his late teens, but his advisors understood the gravity of what was unfolding. If the East collapsed, the West would not be far behind. The Roman army sent to contain the Gothic rebellion was hastily assembled. It was not a unified legion, but a patchwork of provincial detachments, irregular auxiliaries, and elite units pulled from distant regions. Many of them were veterans of Persian wars, unfamiliar with the terrain and expecting a quick, decisive battle. But the Goths were elusive. They avoided open combat and struck at night, melting into forests and marshes. Roman commanders struggled to predict their movements. What began as a policing action had become a guerrilla war. To make matters worse, the Roman generals were plagued by infighting. Senior officers argued over who should lead, who should take credit, and who should answer to whom. Ammianus Marcellinus, a former soldier turned historian who lived through these years, later wrote bitterly of the Roman leadership's arrogance and poor coordination. Even in the face of mounting losses, the empire's command structure wobbled under the weight of pride. Yet not all had lost clarity. Some generals, like Saturninus and Traianus, tasked with overseeing the Thracian front, recognized the danger of underestimating their enemy. They ordered fortifications to be rebuilt, roads to be secured, and bridges watched day and night. Scouts were sent into the hinterlands, but reports were contradictory. Some claimed the Goths were dividing, others that they were uniting. Still more feared they were receiving help from beyond the Danube. Those fears were not unfounded. As the months dragged on, word reached Roman ears of Gothic envoys riding north, carrying messages across the great river. Their destination, the lands of the Greuthungi, another powerful Gothic tribe living in the steppes beyond, in what is now southern Ukraine. Though culturally linked to the Tervings already within the empire, the Greuthungi had remained independent. Now, with tensions escalating, they were being invited to join the rebellion, and others were watching too. Beyond the Greuthungi, further east still, the vast horizon was disturbed by the hoofbeats of the Huns. A rising force from the Eurasian steppes, their exact origins were still a mystery to Roman chroniclers, but their impact was not. Nomadic, fast-moving, and brutal, the Huns had already shattered Gothic settlements in the years before the Danube crossing. Their presence now threatened to reignite the chaos, not just outside the empire, but within it. Inside the Roman Senate, debate turned to fear. Some argued that the refugee crisis had become an invasion. Others pointed fingers at Valens, accusing him of mismanagement and imperial overreach. In the border cities of Thrace, Marcianopolis, Philippopolis, and even Adrianople, civilians fled into walled towns, unsure whether Roman banners or Gothic war cries would appear next over the horizon. What had begun as a humanitarian gesture was now spiraling into one of the greatest crises the Eastern Empire had yet faced. And with every week that passed, the chance to resolve it peacefully drifted further away, carried off on the cold winds of the approaching winter. By the close of 377 CE, winter had gripped the Balkans. The fields outside the walls of Roman towns lay fallow under a sheet of frost. Smoke curled from scattered farmhouses, but many homes had been abandoned, their owners fled or killed. In the rolling hills and forests of Thrace, the region now spanning southern Bulgaria and parts of Greece and Turkey, the Roman state was losing its grip. Rather than retreat or surrender, the Gothic forces expanded. Under Fritigern's growing leadership, they began moving in larger, more organized formations, raiding with purpose rather than desperation. They struck Roman supply depots, ambushed convoys on narrow roads, and even began targeting fortified towns. Roman garrisons, under-provisioned and spread thin, were forced to withdraw into urban centres, ceding the countryside almost entirely. In response, Valens ordered a fresh build-up of troops along the eastern frontier. Reinforcements from Asia Minor were redirected to Thrace. These were men accustomed to the dry highlands of modern-day Turkey, not the icy wetlands of the Balkans. Cold, hungry, and demoralized, they marched north, but too slowly to prevent disaster. Meanwhile, the Gothic army grew. As Fritigern's forces moved from province to province, they were joined by escaped slaves, Roman deserters, and local peasants disillusioned with imperial rule. Many had lost everything: crops, homes, family, in the chaos. They saw no help coming from Constantinople, but Fritigern offered food, security, and vengeance. The result was a strange and swelling coalition of rebels, bandits, and displaced peoples. A shadow society rising where Roman order had collapsed. At the same time, new Gothic groups began crossing the Danube from the north. Despite earlier Roman promises to block the frontier, the river now ran uncontrolled. Ice and fog cloaked the borderlands. By night, Gothic rafts and makeshift bridges ferried more tribes into imperial territory. Some were Gritungi, the same tribe Valens had once refused entry. Others were fragments of smaller groups displaced by Hunnic expansion further east. Each arrival tilted the balance further away from Rome. The imperial generals stationed in Thrace now faced a dilemma. They lacked the strength to expel the Goths outright, but feared that waiting any longer would embolden the enemy further. In early 378 CE, they attempted a bold plan, a coordinated pincer movement to trap the Gothic main host between two Roman forces, one advancing from the east under General Traianus, the other sweeping down from the north under Frigeridus. On parchment, the strategy seemed sound. In the field, it unravelled almost immediately. Poor communication, difficult terrain, and the unpredictable movements of the Gothic cavalry doomed the plan from the outset. One Roman column became bogged down near the mountain passes of the Haemus range. Another was delayed by snow and sabotage. Meanwhile, Fritigern, tipped off by spies or perhaps simply more attuned to the terrain, withdrew his forces into the hills, slipping through the trap before it could be sprung. Worse still, a major Roman detachment was ambushed near the town of Debaltum, in what is now southeastern Bulgaria. The battle was short and devastating. Roman ranks broke under the weight of the charge, and survivors fled south in disarray. When news of the defeat reached Valens in Constantinople, the emperor's temper boiled. He dismissed reports that the Gothic threat was growing, blaming the loss on local commanders. But in truth, the empire was bleeding, not just men, but morale. Inside the capital, rumours flew. Some whispered that Fritigern was in league with foreign powers. Others claimed that Gratian in the west would use the chaos as an excuse to march east and seize sole control of the empire. Political paranoia mingled with military fear. And through it all, Valens remained isolated, increasingly mistrustful of his own advisors. In the spring of 378 CE, with snow beginning to melt along the lower slopes of the Balkan hills, Valens made a decision that would shape the fate of the empire. He would march north and face the Goths himself. He would not wait for Gratian's reinforcements from the west. He would not share the coming victory, and he would not repeat the mistakes of the year before. At least, that was the plan. Even as Roman troops began assembling near the fortified city of Adrianople, known today as Edirne in modern Turkey, the Gothic army was already on the move. They travelled not as a single column, but as a network of warbands, herding wagons and families along as they went. They were not simply an army. They were a people in motion. Thousands of warriors, women, and children drawn together by trauma, fury, and survival. And they would not be easily defeated. As the summer of 378 dawned, the stage was nearly set for one of the most catastrophic military encounters in Roman history. A clash that would not just determine the fate of an emperor, but shake the very foundations of the empire itself. Chapter 5. The Emperor Marches. the spring of 378 CE arrived not with renewal but with dread. In the streets of Constantinople, today known as Istanbul, a quiet anxiety moved through the city like mist. The rhythms of daily life continued, but something felt off. Grain prices rose. Markets slowed. Merchants whispered about raids in the north. Veterans sat silently in taverns, fingers curled around warm cups, staring into the distance. For months, word had come south from Thrace, reports of burned towns, missing caravans, and Gothic warbands on the move. Now, the shadow of that conflict felt close. Far to the northwest, in the province of Thrace, a region that today spans Bulgaria and the European edge of Turkey, Emperor Valens prepared to reclaim what had been lost. The Gothic uprising was no longer a crisis, it was a full-blown war, and it was one the Eastern Roman Empire could no longer ignore. The roots of the conflict lay nearly 2 years earlier. In 376 CE, a large group of Gothic refugees known as the Tervings had begged for asylum across the Danube River. Driven from their lands by a terrifying new enemy, the Huns, these Gothic tribes hoped to find shelter inside the Roman Empire. Valens, seeing a chance to recruit future soldiers, agreed to let them in. But the plan collapsed. Roman officials exploited the refugees, withheld food, and allowed corruption to fester. The Tervings revolted. What began as a humanitarian tragedy soon became a violent rebellion, one that had spread across the countryside like wildfire. By 378, the Tervings were no longer alone. They had been joined by other Gothic factions, including the Greuthungi, a separate group of Goths from the steppes north of the Black Sea, roughly modern-day Ukraine. Unlike the Tervings, who had lived in forested lands along the Danube, the Greuthungi were nomadic horsemen, trained in open warfare and raiding. Together, these groups formed a mobile and unpredictable enemy. And they weren't fighting alone. Their ranks had grown. Alongside the Gothic tribes now marched Roman deserters, soldiers who had abandoned their posts during the chaos and defected to the enemy, often in search of survival or revenge. Other groups, too, had joined, discontented provincial militias, former border raiders, and opportunists from Rome's neglected frontier zones. Some were Gothic. Others came from Balkan clans or Dacian descendants who had long resented Roman control. It was a coalition built not by shared culture, but by shared fury, a fury directed squarely at Rome. Valens had ruled the Eastern Roman Empire for nearly 14 years. In his late 40s, he was experienced, but his reputation had always stood in the shadow of his older brother, Valentinian I. Valentinian had ruled the Western Empire from 364 until his sudden death in 375. He had earned respect as a strict military reformer and a hardened battlefield commander. He built fortresses across Gaul, fought along the Rhine, and left behind a legacy of strength and discipline. Compared to him, Valens was quieter, more political, shaped less by the sword and more by the palace. But he had survived court intrigue, religious conflict, and war with Persia. And now he saw a final chance to leave a mark of his own. There was, however, one complication. Gratian, the teenage co-emperor in the west, had recently defeated Germanic invaders along the Rhine. Energized by his success, he had begun marching east to reinforce Valens. But Valens, unwilling to share credit, saw that as a threat. He feared being overshadowed by a boy. And so, even as Gratian's army approached, Valens decided to move without him. Messengers were dispatched. Across the provinces of Asia Minor, soldiers were called up from garrisons and frontier posts. From Cappadocia and Syria came heavy infantry and auxiliary skirmishers. Cavalry arrived from Armenia. The Scholae Palatinae, the elite imperial guard, rode in from Constantinople, tall riders armoured in mail, lances upright in formation. Veterans of the Persian Wars joined conscripts from the cities. Latin orders rang out beside Greek dialects. By midsummer, the Eastern Army stood assembled, 15 to 20,000 men strong. They were not the legions of Caesar's time, but they were hardened, disciplined, and determined. The sun burned across Thrace. The roads were cracked and dusty. Supply lines strained. Soldiers foraged for food. They drank from shallow streams, passed through villages half empty, and marched toward danger with armor stained in sweat and dust. Within the command tent, pressure mounted. Valens met regularly with his senior officers, a core group of high-ranking military officials who had risen through years of campaign and crisis. Among them was Victor, the Magister Equitum, the master of cavalry in the east, a respected figure known for his caution and loyalty. There was Sebastianus, a Roman general recently sent from Gratian's court to restore discipline in the eastern ranks. And there was Traianus, a veteran commander from earlier wars with Persia, who now oversaw the defense of Thrace itself. Each man brought experience, but their advice conflicted. Some urged patience, to wait for Gratian's arrival. Others pressed for immediate attack. Meanwhile, reports from scouts were muddled. Some claimed the Goths were retreating, low on supplies. Others said they had regrouped and fortified themselves in a wagon camp near Adrianople. No one could confirm the size of the Gothic cavalry. No one knew where the Greuthungi riders had gone. The only thing clear was that the enemy was nearby, and watching. That enemy was led by Fritigern, the Gothic chieftain who had once tried to negotiate peace with Rome. A charismatic and cunning leader, Fritigern now commanded a coalition of Gothic warbands, allied steppe riders, and Roman defectors. His army included not only warriors, but women, children, and elders, all travelling together in a slow-moving column of wagons. But beneath the appearance of a refugee train was a disciplined and deadly force. They had mastered mobile warfare. They could disappear into forests or strike from horseback across open plains, and they were determined to resist Roman control at any cost. Fritigern knew he couldn't match Roman strength in a direct battle unless he shaped the field himself. So he turned to deception. He sent envoys to Valens offering hostages and peace. He asked for negotiations. He promised a peaceful settlement. But all of it was a delay. Behind the scenes, his warriors were preparing for something else. In the first days of August in the year 378, Roman scouts reported a Gothic encampment positioned just a few miles from Adrianople, a shallow valley filled with smoke from campfires, wagons circled for defence. From a distance it appeared slow and exposed. Some commanders saw an opening. That evening, Valens called his council. The atmosphere was tense. Some officers pressed for immediate assault. Others warned of traps, of hidden cavalry, and the possibility of reinforcements. But the emperor had waited long enough. He gave the order to attack. That night the Roman camp settled into silence. Soldiers slept beneath the stars, weapons stacked beside them. Spears stood planted in the earth like markers on a field. The fires burned low, and from across the valley, faint sounds echoed through the darkness. The sound of hammers on iron, the whispers of movement, and the wind bending low through the hills. Valens stood alone beneath the imperial standard, the dragon of the east flickering in the firelight. He had the army, he had the moment. But across the plain, something waited. Something more than just an enemy. Something that would break the empire open. At dawn, on a sweltering morning, in the first week of August in the year 378, the Roman army broke camp. The sun was already rising over the hills of Thrace, casting long shadows through the dry grass and shimmering against the armour of 15,000 men. Dust rose with every step. Sweat clung to faces and soaked through tunics beneath segmented cuirasses. The air was hot, dry, and silent, a silence heavy with expectation. The march was slower than expected. Valens had hoped to reach the Gothic position before midday, but the landscape betrayed him. The army moved across uneven ridges and shallow ravines. Their columns stretched thin. The cavalry outriders were scattered. Supply wagons lagged behind, and the Gothic camp, nestled in a low valley behind a ring of wagons and smoke, remained just out of reach. Hours passed, and the men marched without food or water. By the time the Roman vanguard reached the field near Adrianople, they were already exhausted. Valens had not intended to fight in this condition, but time was running out. He had received word that Gratian's army was only days away. He could no longer afford to wait. And so, despite the fatigue, despite the disarray in the ranks, he gave the order to prepare for battle. The enemy was visible across the plain. Fritigern's camp lay beyond a shallow slope, protected by a circular barricade of wagons, a lager, as the Goths called it. Inside were not just warriors, but families, supply carts, and non-combatants. Smoke rose from cook fires. A few riders moved along the perimeter, but the camp seemed still. Too still. Fritigern did not attack. Instead, he sent a delegation under white flags. They carried offers of peace. They promised hostages. They proposed negotiations. Once again. Valens had seen this before. He knew these were stalling tactics, but also knew his men were stretched, hungry, and divided. The infantry had not yet fully formed ranks. The cavalry had not rejoined the main line. His officers urged patience, just enough time to allow the rest of the army to arrive and properly deploy. And so, reluctantly, Valens agreed to wait. Fritigern had achieved his goal. While the Romans waited in the sun, Gothic scouts raced through the forests and hills. The Grithungi cavalry, who had been away from the main camp, were already on their way. These riders were veterans of the steppe, born in the open plains beyond the Dniester. They wore scale armour, rode fast horses, and carried composite bows and spears. They were not yet visible, but they were coming. The delay dragged on. Roman units stood in the open, with little shade and no water. Officers barked orders, trying to maintain formation. Some soldiers dropped from heatstroke. Others broke ranks to search for water or find relief in the shade. Still, no attack came. From across the field, the Gothic camp remained quiet. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Without warning, a column of Gothic cavalry appeared on the ridgeline to the north. Dozens, then hundreds. They had looped around unseen, and now thundered toward the Roman right flank. The ground shook beneath their charge. Dust rose in great clouds. Their war cries echoed through the valley. And at that moment, Fritigern's infantry surged from the wagon camp. The Roman line had no time to adjust. The right flank collapsed first, smashed under the weight of Grithungi riders. The infantry there had been partially formed, their shields loose, their spears lowered too late. Men fell by the dozens. Some units held for moments, then shattered. The centre of the Roman army tried to reposition, but the field was uneven, and orders were lost in the chaos. Cavalry units scrambled to regroup, but many had not yet even arrived. The reserve line was thin. Within minutes, the Roman formation unravelled. Fritigern's warriors flooded into the gap. Some fought with long spears and round shields, others with swords and axes. They moved in fast, coordinated groups, targeting Roman officers, standards, and units trying to reform. The air filled with the sound of metal striking metal, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of panic. It became a rout. Valens, near the centre of the army, found himself cut off. His personal guard tried to rally, but the lines were broken on all sides. The Roman left where the Scholae Palatinae had taken position, held longer, but even they were surrounded. Units that had marched together for years were now scattered across hills, ditches, and ravines. What had begun as a proud, structured Roman force was now fragments, each man fighting for himself. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a ruin. Thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead or dying. Others had thrown down their arms and fled. Gothic warriors looted bodies for armor, swords, and coin. The summer sky burned overhead, and the ground was littered with broken spears, torn standards, and the bodies of men from every corner of the eastern provinces. And the emperor, Valens, was gone. No one saw him fall. Some claimed he was wounded and carried to a farmhouse, which the Goths then set ablaze. Others believed he was struck down in the melee. His body was never recovered. The Eastern Roman Empire had lost not just a battle, but its leader. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills of Thrace, the smoke still rose from the battlefield. The Gothic dead were buried with their people. The Roman dead were left where they fell. The Goths had won, not by superior numbers, but by cunning, timing, and unity. And in the shadow of Adrianople, a terrifying truth took shape. Rome, for the first time in centuries, had lost an emperor to a foreign army on open ground. Chapter 6: The Road to Recovery. The dust of Adrianople had barely settled when the scale of Rome's defeat became clear. In the burning heat of August in the year 378, the Eastern Roman Empire stood in stunned silence. Emperor Valens had vanished, swallowed by smoke and chaos on the battlefield. His body was never found. His army lay shattered across the plains of Thrace, their armor cracked, their banners torn, their formations reduced to fragments. This was not a tactical defeat, it was a collapse, and it sent a shockwave through the empire. The first messengers arrived in Constantinople just days later. Their horses entered the capital lathered in sweat, legs shaking from exhaustion. The couriers themselves, mud-caked, ash-faced, half-starved, brought no imperial fanfare, no scrolls with gilded lettering. They brought silence. And then they brought terror. The news they carried hit the capital like a thunderclap. Valens was dead. The Eastern Field Army had been annihilated. The Gothic coalition was still on the move. For the people of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, it was as if the sky had darkened overnight. Shops shuttered, markets emptied, women clutched their children and whispered prayers in smoky doorways. Roman senators gathered in hurried sessions, faces pale, voices hushed. Soldiers were summoned to the city walls, even as panic crept through the streets. Some believed the Goths would arrive within days. Others feared they were already inside the city. Yet the Gothic forces, though victorious, did not strike at the capital. Fritigern, the Gothic commander who had shattered the Roman army at Adrianople, the ancient Roman city in what is now Edirne, Turkey, now led a loose confederation of warbands, tribal families, and mounted allies. These included the Turvings, the Gothic refugees who had started the uprising 2 years earlier, and the Greuthungi, steppe-based horsemen who had crossed into Roman territory in the chaos that followed. They had no siege engines, no logistical train, no structured supply lines. Their strength was movement, not entrenchment. Instead of besieging Constantinople, they turned south and west. Through the late summer and into the autumn of 378, Gothic bands swept through the countryside of Thrace and Macedonia, lands that now fall across Bulgaria, Greece, and parts of Turkey. Towns were burned, villas were looted. Roman roads, once patrolled and orderly, were now graveyards of overturned wagons and smouldering outposts. Smoke rose over the countryside as entire districts were emptied. Refugees fled toward fortified cities, dragging carts through dust and ash, clutching what little they could carry. Rome had not faced a crisis like this in generations. The death of Valens marked the first time in over 300 years that a Roman emperor had been killed in open battle by a foreign enemy. Not since the 3rd century crisis, when the empire had nearly splintered apart, had such an event occurred. And now, as word spread across the eastern provinces, fear gave way to something deeper: doubt. Who would lead? Who would command the east? In the Western court, the young co-emperor Gratian faced the burden of a decision that could reshape the empire. Gratian, barely 20, had already proven himself in battle, leading campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Rhine. But the east was bleeding, its army broken, its political structure in disarray. If Gratian moved too slowly, local generals might seize power. If he moved too boldly, he risked alienating the eastern aristocracy. He needed someone who could rebuild the east, someone the army would follow and the provinces would trust. He chose Theodosius. Once a general of great promise, Theodosius had withdrawn from public life after the mysterious execution of his father. Theodosius the Elder, a respected Roman commander who had been killed under uncertain circumstances in North Africa. The younger Theodosius had retired to his estates in Hispania, what is now Spain, where he had lived in silence, away from the intrigues of court. But Gratian remembered him. He remembered how Theodosius had restored order in Britain when the legions faltered, how he had rebuilt shattered units in Africa, how he had fought the Sarmatians and the Alemanni, and returned victorious. And now, in the aftermath of Adrianople, Gratian called him back. In the final weeks of 378, imperial envoys arrived at Theodosius's villa with a purple robe and a summons. The journey to the eastern court was slow, passing through provinces marked by fire and flight. Theodosius saw it all: villages still smouldering, roads blocked by carts of the dead, children clutching the hands of widowed mothers. Here was not just a battlefield lost, but a world shaken. Fields were untended, fortresses unmanned. Roman order, once the bedrock of the East, now lay fractured. In early 379 CE, Theodosius was officially declared Emperor of the East. He accepted the purple not with triumph, but with solemn purpose. There was no ceremony, no parade, just a quiet recognition that he had been chosen not to rule but to rebuild, and the task ahead would be immense. In the opening weeks of 379 CE, Theodosius began the quiet, grueling work of rebuilding an empire that had just survived catastrophe. He inherited not a functioning military apparatus, but the ashes of one. The Eastern Field Army no longer existed. Thousands of soldiers had perished at Adrianople, and those who had survived were scattered. Some wounded, some deserters, many traumatized. Garrisons across Thrace and the Balkans were undermanned. Supply chains had broken, treasury coffers were bleeding. Cities, even ones untouched by battle, had become islands of fear, reluctant to send recruits or grain without guarantees of protection. But Theodosius did not hesitate. From his temporary seat in Thessalonica, the Roman stronghold in what is now northern Greece, he issued a series of rapid, calculated orders. He called for levies from across the eastern provinces: Illyricum, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. Officers were dispatched to recruit not just veterans, but farmers, tradesmen, and convicts. Every able-bodied man of age was now eligible. Units that had ceased to exist were revived in name alone, to preserve the illusion of continuity. The armour and equipment lost at Adrianople were replaced with whatever could be found, including gear recovered from abandoned forts, stored in old arsenals, or repurposed from decommissioned units. This was not the glory of Rome's past. This was survival by thread and sinew. At the same time, Theodosius ordered the fortification of key urban centres. Cities like Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv, Bulgaria, Nisus, now Niš in Serbia, and Hadrianopolis, in modern-day Edirne, Turkey, were reinforced with new earthworks, wooden palisades, and watchtowers. Roads were cleared and repaired where possible, but patrols were small and irregular. Gothic bands still roamed the countryside, and travellers risked ambush with every journey. Meanwhile, the Gothic coalition remained a menace, but not a unified one. After the shock of Adrianople, Fritigern's authority had grown, but not uncontested. The Gothic warbands under his leadership were not a single army, but a web of allies, raiders, and refugee clans. Some groups, especially the Tervings, remained loosely aligned with him. Others, particularly more independent Greuthungi cavalry bands, broke away to pursue their own raids deeper into the Roman provinces. In some towns, local Gothic chieftains began to act like warlords, demanding tribute from Roman settlements in exchange for temporary peace. Fritigern himself remained elusive. He continued to move with a core force, pillaging where opportunity allowed, but always avoiding a pitched battle. He knew the Romans were rebuilding. He knew their numbers would grow. And so, like a wolf in winter, he chose to bleed the empire, not confront it. Theodosius, however, was not simply rebuilding legions. He was also rebuilding confidence. To the soldiers he offered steady pay and security for their families, drawn from emergency levies and redirected provincial taxes. To the cities he sent letters of imperial assurance, promising food shipments and personal envoys. In time, he even began to hold public ceremonies again, short, restrained affairs in which returning veterans were honoured, banners were raised, and Rome's survival was proclaimed aloud in stone forums and basilicas. It was theatre, but it was theatre Rome needed, and he did not do this alone. Theodosius drew around him a team of veteran officers and administrators, many of whom had served under his father. Among them was Ricimer, a Frankish-born Roman general who had survived Adrianople and now served as a bridge between eastern and western forces. Another was Saturninus, a seasoned governor with experience in frontier logistics. And most critically, Theodosius opened direct communication with Gratian, who remained emperor in the west. For the first time in years, the Roman Empire, east and west, acted with shared urgency. But the scars ran deep. In the countryside, entire regions were still depopulated. Fields had gone unploughed. Aqueducts and roads, so vital to the movement of armies and grain, had fallen into neglect. Banditry increased. Even within the cities, fear lingered. The memory of Adrianople had etched itself into the bones of the East. The empire might still stand, but it now knew it could bleed. In secret, Theodosius also began reaching out to certain Gothic leaders with offers of foedus, a type of treaty in which barbarian groups were settled inside Roman territory in exchange for military service. These agreements, controversial even within the imperial court, would lay the groundwork for an uneasy future. But for now, they served a practical need: buying time. By the summer of 379 CE, the Roman army in the east had grown once more. It was not the same as before. It was younger, less trained, and stitched together from the fringes of the empire. But it was an army, and it stood between the Goths and the cities of the Balkans. Rome had survived its darkest hour, just barely. But this was no triumph. This was the beginning of a long, uncertain road. A road built not with glory, but with grit. A road that would reshape the empire itself. Chapter 7. The Peace That Wasn't. By the early spring of 380 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire had regained its footing. The new emperor, Theodosius, had raised an army, rebuilt alliances with the Western court, and fortified the Balkans against further disaster. On paper, it seemed that order had returned, But beneath the surface, Rome remained dangerously unstable. The heart of the problem lay in Thrace and Moesia, regions spanning parts of modern-day Bulgaria, Serbia, and northern Greece. These provinces were still teeming with Gothic warbands, most of whom had not been defeated, but simply left to roam. The Roman state had neither the strength nor the resources to remove them by force. So Theodosius pursued another path: diplomacy. That spring, Roman officials reached out to Gothic leaders with terms. If they laid down arms, they could settle on Roman land as foederati. Allied tribes under Rome's protection expected to supply troops when called upon. It was not a new idea. Rome had used similar arrangements with Franks and Alemanni in the west. But this time, the scale was far larger. The Goths were not a few thousand warriors. They were a displaced people numbering in the tens of thousands, including families, elders, and armed men. Allowing them to settle within the empire was a calculated risk. The treaty was signed near Sadiqa, modern-day Sofia, Bulgaria, in late spring. Several Gothic leaders, including some who had once followed Fritigern, agreed to the terms. The details were deliberately vague. The Goths were promised land and grain, but no specific provinces were named. In return, they pledged military service and peace. Theodosius framed it as a major achievement, an end to the bloodshed that had begun in 376 CE. In Constantinople, the Senate declared the crisis resolved. Statues were raised, coins were minted, public games resumed. But in the provinces, the reality was far murkier. Many Gothic bands refused the treaty outright. Some demanded better terms. Others simply vanished into the forests and mountains, beyond the reach of imperial envoys. Roman commanders, trying to enforce the treaty's terms, found themselves unsure who was covered by the deal and who remained an enemy. Raids continued, small, sporadic, but constant. Farmlands were still burned, forts still attacked, and the Gothic leaders who had signed the treaty often lacked the power to control their more independent counterparts. The peace, in truth, was not a peace at all. It was a pause, a breathing space, and already it was starting to crack. By summer in the year 380, the illusion of calm began to slip. On the roads outside Nicopolis, in modern-day Nikopol in Bulgaria, a Roman supply convoy was ambushed by Gothic raiders. Grain carts were overturned, oxen killed, and the soldiers escorting them slain or scattered. It was not an isolated event. From the plains of Moesia to the wooded hills of Thrace, raids flared up again, unpredictable and brutal. The so-called peace had lasted barely a season. For Roman farmers, the nightmare had returned. In rural villages, smoke once again curled above thatched rooftops as settlements burned. Families abandoned their fields. Some sought protection behind city walls, others fled entirely, heading south towards the Aegean coast. What remained was a growing stretch of empire where Roman law held no sway. The countryside became a patchwork of fortified villas, silent ruins, and Gothic encampments, each one uncertain of the other's allegiance. Inside the Roman military ranks, morale wavered. Commanders did not know whether to treat Gothic parties as allies or enemies. Some were operating under treaty, others were fugitives, and still others posed as friends while pillaging at night. The chain of command buckled under the strain. Soldiers sent to patrol the roads were often outnumbered and unsure who to engage. Discipline cracked. In some units, desertion increased. Emperor Theodosius, ruling from Thessalonica, faced a grim dilemma. His forces were not ready for a new full-scale war. His freshly rebuilt legions were undertrained, his treasury still strained. The Gothic Confederation, fractured as it was, remained dangerous. A second Adrianople could not be risked, so he turned once more to diplomacy, but this time with less success. Gothic leaders now sensed Roman weakness. They demanded more land, more grain, more autonomy. Some wanted permanent homes in the Danube provinces, free from Roman oversight. Others insisted their warriors be exempt from direct imperial command. These were not requests. They were ultimatums. And they revealed a painful truth. The Goths no longer saw themselves as outsiders begging for refuge. They now saw themselves as settlers, power brokers within Rome's frontier. To many Roman officials, this shift was intolerable. In the Senate, letters from the provinces painted a picture of encroaching chaos. Landowners complained of unpaid rents, lost estates, and Gothic levies stripping the countryside bare. Governors warned of open rebellion. And all the while, Rome's eastern cities remained crowded with refugees, some Roman, some Gothic, sharing food, space, and suspicion. The treaty, once seen as a masterstroke, was now a source of daily tension. In Constantinople, rumours spread that Fritigern had returned, that he was raising a new host somewhere in the north. Others whispered that Gothic spies walked freely in the capital, watching, waiting. Whether true or not, the fear was real. And fear, more than anything, was reshaping the empire. Chapter 8: When Water Turns to Ash. The sky above the lower Balkans hung heavy with rain clouds in the early spring of 381 CE. What should have been a season of renewal brought only mud, hunger, and the quiet dread of another lost year. In the fields near Hadrianopolis, in modern-day Edirne in Turkey, ox-drawn ploughs sat unused. Roman aqueducts, once flowing with clear water, now ran dry or silt-choked. Fountains in provincial towns sputtered or stood silent. A land once known for its rivers and fertile plains now bore the marks of war and neglect. The damage was not just physical, it was psychological. The rivers that had once carried Roman barges and bound the provinces together had become boundaries, between order and chaos, Roman and Gothic, life and ruin. Farmers no longer trusted the roads. Merchants avoided open travel. Entire estates had been swallowed by overgrowth or torched to cinders. And the forests, once full of game, were now rumoured to hide Gothic scouts. Rome had survived Adrianople. It had rebuilt its army and appointed new governors. But it had not restored trust. In village squares, citizens asked the same question again and again. Where was the empire? Where was the emperor? Where were the legions? Theodosius, still in Thessalonica, was working tirelessly. His new officers crisscrossed the provinces, enforcing tax relief, assessing damage, attempting to restore irrigation and grain storage. But for every aqueduct repaired, another collapsed from neglect. For every town calmed, another was shaken by raids. The Roman machine, famed for its order and endurance, now moved like a wounded creature, too slow to outpace the pain. At the same time, Gothic groups still roamed with impunity. Even those under treaty rarely honoured their obligations. Some settled in Roman lands, as promised. Others claimed what they wanted by force. Their presence meant instability, not constant violence, but an ambient threat. At any moment, a band could splinter and turn hostile. Local commanders lacked both clarity and confidence. Few dared to disarm the Goths. Fewer still could do so successfully. Yet, despite this gloom, Theodosius refused to yield. In a dramatic shift that spring, he issued imperial orders to rebuild the riverine networks. Crews were dispatched to dredge silted canals, repair crumbled bridges, and clear ancient Roman harbours on the Danube. Engineers from Alexandria, Antioch, and Cappadocia were summoned, men who had studied under the last generation of imperial builders. Grain ships were redirected from Egypt, pushing north to feed the starving Balkans. Though progress was slow, the work began. It was a bold gamble, not just to fix what was broken, but to restore faith in Rome's endurance. and it marked the beginning of a subtle but vital transformation, not of conquest, but of recovery. As spring bled into summer in the year 381, signs of life returned to the war-torn Balkans. Along the Via Egnatia, the ancient Roman road linking the Adriatic to Byzantium, new columns of carts moved eastward, carrying grain, timber, and iron tools. Theodosius had ordered that trade routes be reopened, if only in segments. Even broken roads, he declared, must feel the weight of Roman wheels again. But travel remained dangerous. Gothic detachments still occupied pockets of land north of the Maritsa River. Though some were bound by treaty, others acted freely, seizing tolls at bridges, raiding isolated storehouses, or harassing labour crews. Roman patrols travelled in pairs now, one for defence, the other to carry news in case the first vanished. To build was an act of defiance. Every milestone planted in the ground became a statement that Rome would not surrender the land to ruin. In towns like Philippopolis, in modern-day Plovdiv in Bulgaria, a new rhythm emerged. The markets reopened, though the stalls were fewer. Blacksmiths returned, hammering salvaged metal into nails and horseshoes. Forums echoed again with voices, not debates, but arguments over taxes, shortages, and Gothic settlements too close for comfort. Roman law had not disappeared, but it walked nervously through its own streets. Theodosius, watching all this from Thessalonica, remained tireless. He ordered the construction of waterworks, not just aqueduct repairs, but new wells in garrisoned towns, cisterns in fortified granaries. He knew that water, more than weapons, would determine survival. Soldiers could not march on dry mouths. Cities could not function with empty fountains. In these efforts, he was aided by a growing cohort of engineers, many drawn from eastern cities spared by the war. These men, some Syrian, some Greek, others Illyrian, worked with relentless purpose. They dug into scorched earth, mapped broken piping, and restored ancient Roman blueprints. One such project, begun that summer, sought to reconnect Hadrianopolis to the smaller towns to its south via a restored aqueduct system. It would take years, but work began. Still, none of this was guaranteed to succeed. Bandits often struck at night. Tools vanished, surveyors were found dead in ravines, and always the looming presence of Gothic unrest pressed against every border. Yet within the fear, something else began to stir. A quiet defiance. Among Roman citizens, especially the young, stories spread of engineers who rebuilt collapsed towers, of centurions who stood their ground against midnight raiders, of towns that fed both Romans and Goths to keep the peace. These tales, half truth and half hope, gave rise to a strange new pride. Not in Rome's past, but in its persistence. Rome had once conquered with legions. Now it resisted with shovels. And somehow that resistance was beginning to matter. Chapter 9. Rebuilding the Broken Line. By the winter of 381 CE, a bitter wind curled through the valleys of the central Balkans. Snow clung to the pine-covered slopes, and smoke rose in thin trails from scattered Roman outposts. Small stone garrisons perched along crumbling roads. These lonely stations, once waypoints in a tightly knit military network, had become lifelines. In the wake of Adrianople and the chaos that followed, the empire had lost more than soldiers. It had lost its reach. Theodosius knew that if Rome was to recover its eastern provinces, it could not rely on city walls alone. The countryside, from the Danube to the Aegean, had to be stitched back together, not just with fortresses, but with roads, rivers, and signal towers. The frontier must breathe again. So that winter, a vast imperial directive was issued from Thessalonica. Roman engineers, soldiers, and civilian labourers were dispatched across Thrace and Moesia to begin a long and punishing task. restoring the limes, the defensive and logistical system that once protected the empire's northern edge. Every road cleared, every way station rebuilt, every beacon lit was a message to the people and the enemy alike. Rome still held the line. The work was grueling. Frostbitten hands gripped pickaxes. Old bridges were hauled from rivers and reinforced with timber and stone. Defensive towers, collapsed since the early raids of 377, were rebuilt on higher ground with improved sight lines. Some garrisons were reoccupied, others had to be constructed from scratch. Fortifications near vital river crossings, especially along the Hebros and Iskar, were prioritized. These would not only protect against raids but re-establish trade routes that had gone silent for years. But the true challenge was not the terrain, it was manpower. Rome's legions, even after Theodosius's reforms, were stretched thin. To fill the gaps, local auxiliaries were recruited, many of them young Thracians and Motians who had grown up amid fire and famine. Some joined out of loyalty, others for food. A few, quietly, had Gothic blood. It was a risk, but one Theodosius had to take. Despite the uncertainty, the effort began to bear fruit. Signals once again flickered across the hills. Caravans resumed movement, guarded by detachments that, while understrength, showed the empire's flag. In border towns like Singidunum, in modern-day Belgrade, shops reopened. Not in full, but enough to matter. And as the line extended eastward, hope followed in its shadow. This was not the iron grip of past emperors. It was something far more fragile. But it was working. Rome, scarred and diminished, was learning to stand again. By early 382 CE, the rebuilt watchtowers along the Thracian hills pulsed with firelight again. At dusk, soldiers climbed narrow stairs to light beacons in clay braziers. The flames flickered against the snow-capped ridgelines, sending coded signals across valleys, a heartbeat of empire. For the first time in years, Rome's eastern provinces had eyes. In one garrison near Nisus, in modern-day Niš in Serbia, the walls had been patched with mismatched stone. Bronze fittings had been scavenged from ruined villas, and the roof was made of pine planks blackened from age. But within those walls, soldiers drilled again. Their shields were old, many dented and rehammered, and their tunics bore more stitching than dye. Yet they stood in formation each morning, spears upright, boots crunching frost. To travellers passing by, it looked like Rome, not its golden memory, but its living echo. Even more remarkable than the forts was the revival of communication. The Roman cursus publicus, once the fastest messaging system in the ancient world, had collapsed in the chaos of 376. Couriers had been killed. Relay stations had burned. Now, in 382, it began to stir again. Riders on sturdy Balkan horses carried sealed letters between provincial capitals. Some brought reports of Gothic movements, others held requisitions, tax records, or even imperial orders. The routes were shorter, the pace slower, but the line had been restored. Among these riders were veterans, men who had once fought at Adrianople and survived. They wore no medals, but locals knew them by sight, grizzled, limping, often silent. Their presence was a reminder of what had been lost, and what could still be regained. Not all was triumph. There were still ambushes in the woods. A fortress near the Danube was abandoned after repeated attacks. Some way stations were looted days after being restored, and whispers travelled faster than any courier that Gothic groups were still arming, that new leaders were rising, that another war might yet break out. But something had changed. The people, Roman citizens, auxiliaries, merchants, and freedmen had begun to rebuild without waiting for orders. In one village, townsfolk cleared a collapsed aqueduct arch on their own. In another, a local priest repurposed marble from a ruined temple to repair a grain silo. In Philippopolis, a school reopened in a private home where children once again recited Latin verses beside walls pocked by arrows. This was not Rome in its glory, but it was Rome in defiance. A scattered, half-healed frontier had begun to whisper a message, not of conquest, but of endurance. The line between civilization and collapse was no longer a fortress wall. It was the will to keep standing. Chapter 10. The Fires of Reconciliation. In the late summer of 382 CE, a hush fell over the marble halls of Constantinople. The capital, still glittering with imperial splendor, had not felt the sting of war like the provinces, but its soul had been shaken. Statues of Mars, once polished with reverence, now stood ignored. Veterans in the city bore their scars like warnings, not trophies. And in the eastern court of Emperor Theodosius, a decision weighed heavy on every tongue. Should Rome make peace with the Goths? For 6 long years the empire had bled. It had suffered the horror of Adrianople, endured famine, seen legions crumble and provinces fracture. And now, with no clear victory in sight, Theodosius considered something unthinkable to many senators, a treaty that would allow the Goths to settle permanently within imperial borders. This was not surrender, but it was not triumph either. In a solemn procession that September, envoys from the Gothic factions arrived outside the gates of Constantinople. They were not the ragged fugitives of 376. These men, leaders under Fritigern's legacy and others who had risen in his absence, arrived on horseback, cloaked in furs, bearing the weight of survival. Behind them marched warriors in patchwork armor, some with Roman shields taken from old battlefields, others with spears carved from Balkan oak. The negotiations did not happen in public. They unfolded behind sealed doors, where Roman and Gothic leaders sat beneath mosaics of Jupiter and Christ, under the cold gaze of marble busts. The terms were delicate. The Goths would be granted land, uncultivated territory along the Danube frontier. In return, they would serve as federati, allied soldiers under Roman command, but led by their own chieftains. It was a gamble. The Goths would not be fully Roman. They would remain distinct, semi-independent, and armed. But they would also be fed, housed, and, crucially, employed. Outside the palace, the city murmured. Some saw hope in the treaty, a chance to end the war without further ruin. Others saw betrayal. In the bathhouses and forums, angry voices cried out, "How can wolves guard the sheep?" Yet Theodosius pressed forward. To ease tensions, he ordered a week of public games. Chariot races were held in the hippodrome. Bread was distributed freely. Statues damaged in riots were quietly repaired. For a fleeting moment, the city exhaled, but not all eyes were on the festivities. In the hills north of the capital, Roman engineers surveyed new lands to be allotted to Gothic settlers. Grain shipments were diverted to stockpile depots along the frontier. And along the rivers, military scribes began recording Gothic names into the rolls, not as enemies, but as soldiers. The war, it seemed, had not ended in victory, but perhaps it had ended in survival. In the weeks following the Treaty of 382 CE, the machinery of peace began to stir. It moved not with fanfare, but with quiet urgency, the kind born from exhaustion. Across Thrace and Moesia, imperial couriers carried wax-sealed orders to governors, generals, and quartermasters. These scrolls outlined the unthinkable, the legal settlement of Rome's former enemies within its own borders. In the town of Marcianopolis, in modern-day Devnya in Bulgaria, a Roman official stood beneath a broken statue of victory and read aloud the new imperial edict. It was not a proclamation of conquest, it was a contract. The Goths, once fugitives and invaders, were now to be federati, bound to Rome not by chains, but by obligation. In exchange for land and grain, they would fight under Roman banners in future campaigns. They would not be Roman citizens, but neither would they be hunted. Not everyone accepted this. In certain forts, Roman officers burned the orders rather than post them. In others, centurions refused to billet Gothic leaders, claiming it would poison morale. Rumours of mutiny flickered, especially among units that had lost brothers at Adrianople. But Theodosius had anticipated this resistance. Loyal commanders were dispatched to enforce compliance. Grain ships, once destined for the cities, were rerouted to Gothic camps. The message was clear: peace would be upheld, or enforced. Meanwhile, the Gothic response was equally complex. For some chieftains, the treaty offered relief. After years of wandering, their people could finally plant crops without fearing Roman spears. Children who had grown up in tents and ruins could now sleep inside stone houses, crude and cramped, but safe. Elders sang again in their own tongue, not in whispers, but in celebration. But others seethed. Proud warriors bristled at the notion of fighting under Roman command. To many, the treaty reeked of dependency. Fritigern himself, had he lived to see this peace, might have rejected it outright. The very idea of serving the empire they had bled to defy sat like ash in their mouths. Still, camps were pitched, fields marked for sowing, and Gothic scouts began learning Roman military routes, not to raid but to patrol. In these early weeks, the lines between ally and occupier blurred dangerously. Some Roman villagers fled rather than live beside the same warriors who had once burned their homes. Others tried to barter. A few even found common cause, Romans offering tools, Goths offering meat or protection, and in rare cases, friendships formed. In one recorded instance, a retired Roman centurion in Moesia offered his forge to a Gothic smith. Together, they rebuilt ploughs and swords from shattered armour. Their sons, it said, trained together, one in Latin drill, the other in Gothic wrestling. This peace was not a clean wound. It did not heal the past. But in the ashes of war, it offered something Rome had not felt in years, a fragile kind of hope. Chapter 11. The Eastern Fire. In the spring of 383 CE, golden light spilled over the hills of Thrace, warming the tiled roofs of newly repaired Roman towns. The countryside, once scarred by war, now bore the signs of cautious rebirth. Fields that had lain fallow for years shimmered with young barley. Herds moved again across lowland pastures. And in the distance, the aqueducts of Philippopolis once more whispered water into thirsty homes. The empire had not healed, but it had adapted. And at the centre of this fragile stability stood one man, Theodosius, Emperor of the East. His rise had been forged in blood and survival. Yet by 383, he no longer marched behind legions. He governed from Constantinople, not as a warlord, but as a strategist. Within the walls of the Eastern Court, where sunlight lit the gilded mosaics of the great palace, Theodosius reshaped Rome not by conquest, but by calculation. He expanded the role of foederati, allowing barbarian allies to serve in localized units under Roman command, an innovation born of necessity, now embedded in imperial policy. He granted tax relief to towns that had been depopulated by raids, and he restructured military supply chains to favor fortified cities over open highways, knowing that the days of sweeping legions were ending. In public, Theodosius walked slowly through the markets, flanked by soldiers but never armoured. To many Eastern citizens, he was no longer the general who had lost and then regained Thrace. He was now the emperor who had brought quiet to a war-torn land. But not all was quiet. In remote provinces, occasional uprisings still flared, often fueled by Gothic warbands who had not accepted peace. In Moesia, a Roman patrol vanished along a forest road. In the hills near Sardica, in modern-day Sofia in Bulgaria, a fortress commander reported seeing strange campfires beyond the river. Though the capital projected peace, its edges still burned with uncertainty. Inside the palace, Theodosius kept a map of the empire stretched across an oaken table. Tiny figurines, carved from onyx and ivory, marked legions, garrisons, supply depots, and Gothic settlements. He moved them not with ease, but with weight. Each decision he made now carried the pressure of legacy. He knew the peace would not last forever, but he also knew that peace, however temporary, could shape generations. And so he governed with patience, with pragmatism, with fire in his mind, not on the battlefield. It was a different kind of strength, quieter than swords, longer than victories. The East was not reborn, but it was not lost. Not yet. Theodosius did not rule alone. Behind the emperor's calm exterior stood a web of advisors, generals, and clergy, each wielding influence in the slowly reawakening East. Among them was Rufinus, his cunning Praetorian prefect, whose ambition was only matched by his mastery of law. And there was Flavianus, a bishop who pushed for harmony between the old gods and the rising strength of Christianity, fearing civil collapse more than heresy. Their debates echoed through the halls of the great palace, where Mosaic saints looked down upon Mosaic senators. Should imperial funds be used to rebuild temples or churches? Should Gothic leaders be granted Roman titles? Should the army remain centralized or adapt to local defense? In truth, Rome no longer had the luxury of purity. The lines between Roman and barbarian, pagan and Christian, soldier and citizen, had all begun to blur. This change was visible not just in policy, but in people. On the streets of Constantinople, merchants sold Gothic iron beside Syrian spices. In the harbour, Gothic auxiliaries offloaded cargo from Egyptian ships. Roman children now played war games that included both eagles and wolf banners, echoing the strange new armies defending the East. Even Theodosius's own legions had changed. A century earlier, a Roman soldier was defined by his clean-cut armour and Latin tongue. But now, many wore chainmail copied from Germanic tribes. Some spoke Greek, others Gothic. Few had ever seen the city of Rome itself. Yet, under Theodosius, they fought, and they held the line. In 384 CE, a Gothic detachment crushed a pirate uprising in the Aegean. In 385, another unit helped quell a revolt in Cyrenaica, in modern-day Libya. These victories were not grand, but they mattered. The eastern provinces no longer teetered on the edge of ruin. The machine of empire, battered but functioning, had begun to move again. But Theodosius knew that machines need fuel, and his was running out. The tax base was fragile, the Senate increasingly toothless, the borderlands still a patchwork of alliances, bribes, and hopes. Worse, word had come from the West, whispers of imperial instability, of power slipping from weak emperors into the hands of generals. And so Theodosius, ever the realist, began to plan. He did not trust in permanence. He trusted in preparation. He trained officers not in glory, but in survival. He elevated governors who could hold provinces with few troops and fewer resources. And he quietly ordered the construction of new granaries and armories deep within Anatolia, ready for a war that had not yet come. This was the Eastern fire, not a blaze of conquest, but a steady, enduring flame, fed by hard choices, shielded from the winds of collapse. It would burn long after Theodosius was gone, and in time it would be all that remained. Chapter 12. Echoes in the West. As Theodosius rebuilt in the East, the Western Roman Empire whispered its slow decay. The year was 383 CE. In the rolling countryside of Gaul, in modern-day France, the vineyards still bore fruit, and villas sparkled in the early autumn sun. But behind the quiet scenes of prosperity, the foundation of the West had begun to fracture. The emperor there was Gratian, son of Valentinian I. Still young, only in his mid-20s, Gratian had once shown promise. A studious ruler, devoted to the church and admired by Roman elites for his piety and Latin eloquence. But the weight of the empire had pressed hard on his shoulders. He had been co-emperor since childhood, crowned at just 8 years old. And now, as the Western Augustus, Gratian faced a court divided by ambition, provinces haunted by unrest, and an army growing restless. It began in the legions. In the far reaches of Britannia, a Roman general named Magnus Maximus, a Spaniard by birth and a skilled commander, had won glory defending the northern frontier. But glory bred loyalty, and loyalty became power. In the spring of 383, his soldiers declared him emperor. Maximus did not refuse. With swift precision, he crossed into Gaul, gaining support from disillusioned officials and battle-hardened troops. Towns opened their gates without resistance. Bishops blessed his arrival. The people, tired of instability, whispered that perhaps this usurper could restore order. Gratian, caught off guard and poorly advised, fled south. His court fractured, promises of aid went unanswered. And before the year's end, the young emperor was betrayed by his own guards and assassinated near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. His death marked more than the fall of a man. It revealed the West's fatal weakness. It could no longer guarantee loyalty, not in its army, not in its governors, not even in its palaces. Maximus now ruled much of the Western Empire, but he was not Theodosius. He had no vision beyond control, no reforms beyond stability. And though he sought recognition from the East, Theodosius hesitated. A silent rift began to open between the two halves of the empire, one ruled by a cautious statesman, the other by a war-born opportunist. Meanwhile, across the western provinces, in Hispania, in Britannia, in the alpine passes of Raetia, governors tightened their grip. They built walls not just to keep out barbarians, but to guard against each other. Imperial edicts were ignored. Coinage varied from town to town. The great Western machine, once oiled by conquest and unity, now creaked under the strain of survival. And in the shadows of this crumbling order, new voices stirred, voices that would one day cross borders, demand tribute, and strike at Rome's heart. The West, still clothed in imperial symbols, had begun to hollow from within, and its echo, once thunderous across the world, was fading. Maximus ruled from Trier, in modern-day Germany, but his power never reached far beyond the Rhine. To the south, Italy remained under the nominal rule of Valentinian II, Gratian's half-brother. He was just 12 years old when the crown passed to him. The real power behind his throne was Justina, his mother, a sharp, ambitious woman who maneuvered through the treacherous politics of a collapsing court. Their capital, Milan, stood like a fading star, its basilicas still adorned with golden mosaics, its baths still steaming, its senators still draped in purple. But the city's heart had changed. Fear had taken root. Imperial guards patrolled not just for defense, but to watch one another. Supply lines were failing. Italy's economy, once fueled by African grain and Spanish silver, now staggered under growing shortages. And looming above all stood the figure of Ambrose, Bishop of Milan. A former governor turned church leader, Ambrose was no quiet cleric. He challenged emperors, defied generals, and publicly shamed those who opposed the church. He had once barred Theodosius himself from receiving communion, a move unthinkable a century earlier. Now, in the West, he acted as kingmaker. No law passed without his blessing. No ruler stood without his approval. Justina, a staunch Arian Christian, clashed bitterly with him. Their conflict tore through Milan's streets, dividing the city's clergy, its noble families, even its bakeries and blacksmiths. And all the while, Maximus waited, watching the fractures grow. In 387 CE, he made his move. Claiming to defend the Church and the Roman order, Maximus marched into Italy. His forces crossed the Alps with stunning speed. Town after town surrendered, and Justina, fearing for her life and that of her son, fled Milan with Valentinian. They sailed east to Theodosius. What followed was one of the last great moments of Roman imperial resolve. Theodosius, though cautious by nature, saw the danger clearly. If Maximus claimed all of the West, it would mean the end of any hope for unity, and so he prepared for war. But first, he took Valentinian into his court, not just as a refugee, but as a symbolic son. He bathed him in imperial robes. He included him in councils, and he publicly swore that the boy would be returned to his throne. The message to the empire was clear. Theodosius would not allow the East to stand by while the West was consumed. But even as he prepared for the coming storm, Theodosius knew this was not like the wars of old. Rome was not battling Parthians or Carthaginians. This was Roman against Roman, emperor against emperor, brother against brother. It was not just power that was at stake. It was the very soul of the empire. Chapter 13. The Barbarian Tide. The year was 388 CE. Spring rains had swollen the rivers of Pannonia, the Roman frontier province that now spans western Hungary, turning valley roads into slow-moving streams and soaking the forested hills in cold mist. As Theodosius, Emperor of the East, advanced westward through this sodden terrain, the earth seemed to groan beneath the weight of 1,000 armoured feet. This was no ordinary Roman army. Its banners flew Roman eagles, yes, but the men beneath them came from every corner of a fractured world. Illyrian foot soldiers, Iberian cavalry, Moorish javelin men, Anatolian archers, Armenian engineers, and, at its core, the most controversial of all, Gothic federati. Once feared raiders from beyond the Danube, these Gothic warriors now marched in the emperor's name. Their chieftains had struck uneasy bargains with Theodosius in years prior, exchanging swords for land, loyalty for coin. Alongside them rode the Alans, fierce steppe horsemen with plaited hair and slashing sabres, their horses foaming at the bit. This was not a Roman army in the old sense, not the uniformed legions of Caesar or Trajan, but rather a coalition of opportunity, stitched together by imperial promises and desperation. Yet the vision behind it was clear. Theodosius had not gathered this force merely to settle border disputes. His goal was the total destruction of Magnus Maximus, the usurper who had seized power in the West. Maximus, a seasoned general originally hailed by the legions in Britain, now controlled much of Gaul and northern Italy. He had executed the young Western Emperor Gratian in 383 and demanded recognition from the East. But Theodosius, ever cautious and calculating, had waited. And now, 5 years later, his answer came in steel and fire. As the imperial army pushed through Illyricum, today's Western Balkans, it passed through towns that were little more than hollow shells. In many, the forums were overgrown, market stalls collapsed, aqueducts dry. Entire populations had fled to mountain villages or deeper into the forests. There were no cheering crowds, just silent onlookers watching from doorways and crumbling arches, unsure whether salvation or devastation had arrived. Within Theodosius's camp, tensions simmered. Roman commanders eyed their Gothic allies warily, while veterans muttered that the empire had sold its soul. One officer wrote that at night, campfires burned low and conversations drifted into uneasy silence. Theodosius, aware of these divisions, remained distant, focused, solemn, untouchable. He had not come west for glory. He had come to preserve what remained of imperial order. Magnus Maximus, meanwhile, had fortified the region near the River Save, a key crossing in what is now northern Bosnia. His scouts reported the approach of Theodosius's army weeks in advance, but his strength was dwindling. Many of his men, drawn from the garrisons of Gaul and Britannia, were exhausted and underpaid. Though veterans in battle, they now fought more for loyalty to Maximus himself than for any idea of Rome. The two armies met near the Save in early summer. The exact location has long been debated, but the terrain was marked by thick reeds, shallow muddy banks, and low hills cloaked in morning fog. Theodosius positioned his Gothic and Alan troops on the flanks, holding the Roman corps in reserve. As dawn broke, mist clung to the marshes, and the first sounds of war, trumpets, clashing shields, whinnying horses, rippled across the river. When the charge came, it was devastating. Gothic infantry surged through the reeds like wolves, cutting down Maximus's front lines with axes and long swords. Alanic horsemen rode in looping arcs, striking at archers before vanishing into mist. The Roman Palatini, the emperor's elite, broke the enemy's centre. Reports from the time describe chaos, blood-soaked riverbanks, men drowning under the weight of their armour. Bodies floated downstream alongside snapped javelins and broken shields. Maximus attempted to regroup at Aquileia, but morale had shattered. Within days he was betrayed, captured, and executed by order of Theodosius. The victory was decisive. The East had reclaimed the West, for now. But the cost was not measured merely in lives. What became clear on the banks of the Save was something far more profound. Rome's survival now depended on the very peoples it once feared. The Gothic warriors, who had stood over Roman corpses that morning, did not destroy the empire. They held it up. The legions of old, those born in the hills of Latium or the plains of Africa, were gone. In their place stood men from forests, steppes, and distant mountains. The banners still bore Latin words. The eagles still gleamed in gold. But beneath them marched a new empire, one Roman in name, but barbarian in blood. As the dust of battle settled and the eastern banners fluttered over the conquered fields near the Save River, Theodosius did not celebrate. No grand triumph was held, no golden wreath placed on his brow. Instead, he rode through the ruins of Magnus Maximus's final camp in silence. Dead men lay half submerged in marshy water, their armour twisted, faces turned skyward. Crows circled above. This was no glorious return to order. It was a grim confirmation that the old Rome had passed into shadow. When he entered Aquileia, the walled city in modern-day northern Italy, where Maximus had made his last stand, Theodosius found not a court of loyalists, but a frightened council of senators, priests, and merchants. They had not resisted the usurper, nor had they defended the legitimate emperor. They had simply waited to see who would win. Such was the spirit of the West now, uncertain, weary, and bent toward survival. Theodosius ordered a swift purge of the most dangerous collaborators, but spared many others. He did not want martyrs. He wanted obedience. His attention turned quickly to the political puzzle of reunification. The Western court had been shattered after Gratian's death. Theodosius now placed the young Valentinian II, still only a teenager, back on the throne as Western emperor. A puppet, protected by Eastern authority, his court relocated from Milan to Vienne for safety. Behind this gesture of restoration, however, lay a deeper truth. Real power now rested with Theodosius alone. The East had swallowed the West, not by annexation, but by dependence. Valentinian's survival would depend entirely on Theodosius's armies, and Theodosius's armies were no longer entirely Roman. In the months that followed, the emperor issued new laws regulating Gothic settlements within Roman territory. He granted land in Moesia and Thrace, parts of modern-day Serbia and Bulgaria, to federati leaders in exchange for continued military service. These were not mere guest peoples now. They were landlords, warriors, and governors. Rome was becoming something new, a hybrid of imperial tradition and frontier pragmatism. Some Roman senators, especially in Italy and Africa, were aghast. They wrote panicked letters warning of barbarian infiltration, of culture dissolving into chaos. But there was no turning back. The Gothic warriors who had fought at the Save River had proven themselves. They marched, camped, and died under Roman command. In practice, they were now as Roman as anyone else. In Constantinople, public opinion was divided. Some praised Theodosius as a unifier, the man who had restored imperial harmony. Others whispered that he had traded the soul of the empire for a hollow peace. In taverns and bathhouses, veterans spoke of Gothic discipline, of Allan cavalry manoeuvres, of Roman officers speaking through translators to their own troops. The language of empire was changing, from Latin alone to a chorus of dialects drawn from every edge of the known world. And yet, there was still order. Grain flowed, laws were enforced, roads remained open. For a brief moment, Rome had stability, not through dominance, but through compromise. Theodosius had shown that survival no longer depended on the purity of Rome's bloodline, but on the loyalty of its patchwork ranks. But not all were satisfied. In the West, among the remnants of the old aristocracy and the legions who had backed Maximus, resentment simmered. They watched as former enemies rose in power, as Gothic families took Roman lands, as new names filled the roles of command. To them, this was not a rebirth. It was the beginning of the end. And far to the north, beyond the rivers, beyond the forests, others watched as well. The tribes who had not yet entered Rome's orbit saw opportunity. If one Gothic people could rise within the empire, perhaps others could follow. The gates had not been flung open, but they had been left ajar. Chapter 14. The Gathering Storm. By the early spring of 391 CE, the skies above the Danube brooded with a chill that no longer belonged to winter. The ice along the river's edge broke in jagged plates, drifting slowly past Roman forts perched along the southern bank. In Moesia and Dacia, lands that today lie within Serbia and Romania, the frontiers pulsed with tension. Garrison soldiers stationed at Singidunum, the fortress town that would one day become Belgrade, kept their eyes fixed on the northern forests. Something was stirring beyond the trees. The wind came from the steppes, and with it, stories whispered through traders, mercenaries, and deserters. Unseen riders, swift and silent, had been sighted near the Tisa River. Villages beyond Roman reach had vanished without a trace. Columns of smoke rose where none should be. These were not Gothic warbands or Allan raiders. They left no demands, no messengers, no warnings. The Romans had no name for them yet, but they would. Back in Constantinople, Theodosius the Great sat on the throne of a reunited empire, in name, if not in practice. His defeat of Magnus Maximus and the restoration of young Valentinian II in the west had brought a moment of calm. But it was the calm of a man standing in a crumbling house, holding the walls with his bare hands. The provinces of Hispania and Gaul were increasingly governed by local strongmen. In Africa, rival bishops fought over tax exemptions and doctrine. Italy, though formerly under the Western Emperor, was ruled in truth by Arbogast, a general of Frankish blood and imperious will. Theodosius, exhausted by war and palace intrigue, began to shift his attention inward. In 391 CE, he issued a sweeping edict, the final blow against paganism in the empire. Temples across the empire were shuttered, ancient cults suppressed. Statues of Jupiter and Mars were toppled or quietly hidden. In their place rose a new language of crosses, bishops, incense, and Latin hymns echoing through basilicas. But while theology shifted, the threats remained earthly. Borders frayed, armies thinned, and across the Danube, the unknown crept closer. In the forts of the Balkans, officers penned increasingly frantic letters to the capital. Patrols reported strange sightings, unshorn figures on horseback, corpses bearing unrecognizable wounds, weapons made of bone and horn. Scouts went missing, roads fell silent, and in the woods, peasants whispered of ghosts with twisted faces and tongues that spoke no human speech. It was not the Gothic style of war they feared. It was something worse, something primal. Inside the cities, daily life stumbled forward, but with a nervous edge. Marketplaces in towns like Nisus, now Niš in Serbia, saw fewer traders. Local magistrates doubled their guard rotations. Villagers began abandoning frontier hamlets for the safety of walled towns. Priests prayed for deliverance, but even they had begun to look north with apprehension. The Danube, once a fixed border, now seemed like a fragile line drawn in sand. To many Roman citizens, the crisis still felt distant, another barbarian problem that would flare and fade. But to the commanders in the field, the shift was unmistakable. The barbarians beyond the river were no longer mere raiders or refugees. They were organizing, moving, watching, and they were not alone. In the city of Vienne, nestled along the Rhone River in modern-day southeastern France, the teenage Emperor Valentinian II sat in quiet exile. Though his image still appeared on coins and decrees, his presence had become ceremonial, a relic of legitimacy rather than a ruler of men. True power rested in the hands of Arbogast, a seasoned Frankish general who ruled the Western court like a patrician of the old republic. He had no imperial title, yet none dared defy him. He commanded the armies. He appointed governors. He dismissed senators with a glance. And to Valentinian, he offered only cold courtesy. It was Arbogast who now shaped the fate of the Western Empire. From Trier to Milan, his name carried weight, and his influence reached across mountains and provinces. Yet Arbogast was no usurper in the traditional sense. He claimed loyalty to the emperor, even as he stripped him of all meaningful authority. His word was law, not by decree, but by silence. The West obeyed, not because it loved him, but because it feared what would follow without him. In the East, Theodosius watched warily. He distrusted Arbogast's ambitions, but dared not confront him openly. The empire had been fractured too many times. Unity was an illusion held together by correspondence and hope. Instead, Theodosius turned his efforts to strengthening the Danube frontier. But even this was a losing battle. The Foederati, those semi-independent allied tribes settled within Roman lands, were becoming more numerous, more assertive. They demanded more land, more autonomy, and often answered only to their own war chiefs. In Thrace and Moesia, Gothic chieftains now ruled over entire valleys, collecting taxes, settling disputes, and training their warriors beside Roman recruits. These Gothic commanders bore Roman titles, dux, comes, tribunus, but they no longer saw themselves as subordinates. They were partners, or perhaps something more. In practice, the Eastern Empire was becoming a federation of warlords under the thin veneer of imperial oversight. The real storm, however, was still gathering on the steppes. From the shores of the Black Sea to the plains beyond the Carpathians, a new force was beginning to stir. The Huns, a mounted people from the vast lands beyond the Don and the Volga. They moved with terrifying speed, lived in the saddle, and fought with bows of uncanny strength. They did not settle. They swarmed. They did not negotiate. They devoured. The first whispers of their arrival reached Constantinople in the form of broken survivors. Tribes driven from their homes, elders who had seen their villages burned in minutes, warriors who now begged for refuge within Roman walls. Among them were Alans, Sarmatians, and Goths, once proud enemies of Rome, now refugees fleeing an even greater terror. But there was no unity among the displaced. Some begged for land, others raided Roman farms. Still others offered their swords in exchange for gold. Roman generals, overwhelmed by the chaos, responded unevenly. Some embraced the newcomers as allies, others expelled them with brutal force. The borderlands descended into a slow-motion collapse, not of battle, but of cohesion. And still the empire pretended it held. In basilicas, senators prayed to the one true God for peace. In garrisons, centurions drilled recruits too young or too foreign to understand the empire they served. In distant estates, Roman nobles poured wine and recited Virgil, pretending the world had not changed. But it had. And beyond the forests, beyond the Danube, in the sea of grass beneath a burning sun, the thunder of hooves was rising. Chapter 15. Echoes of the Eagle. As dawn broke over the plains of Pannonia in the year 395 CE, the frost still clung to the grass like silver thread. A thin mist rose from the lowlands near the Sava River, now in modern-day Croatia and northern Serbia, where a Roman column was already on the march. Their breath came in clouds, their sandals crushed the brittle earth, and above them the imperial banners snapped softly in the morning wind. They were the last of a dying breed, soldiers of a unified empire that no longer truly existed. Only months earlier, Theodosius the Great, the last man to rule both east and west with unquestioned authority, had died in Milan. He was barely 50. His body was carried to Constantinople and laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, beneath a city whose walls he had fortified, but whose future he could not secure. Upon his death, the Roman Empire was split once again, this time not by civil war or usurpation, but by design. To the east, he left the throne to his eldest son Arcadius, a timid boy of 18. To the west, he named Honorius, barely 11 years old, as emperor in name, and left the real power in the hands of the general Stilicho, a man half Roman, half Vandal, and wholly untrusted by the Eastern court. What remained of Roman unity now lived only in memory. 2 courts, 2 emperors, 2 fates. In the west, Stilicho tried desperately to hold the line. He was a capable commander, hardened by war, and loyal to Rome in a way that seemed increasingly rare. But he was surrounded by vultures, envious generals, corrupt senators, and Gothic mercenaries who owed their allegiance to coin, not country. His task was impossible: to protect a child emperor, to govern a decaying empire, and to do so with armies filled with men who no longer remembered what Rome had been. In the east, Arcadius remained hidden behind court eunuchs and palace intrigue. Real power fell to Rufinus, a bureaucrat whose ambition outstripped his loyalty. Constantinople thrived in marble and ritual, but its frontiers were increasingly left to rot. Provinces that had once sent legions now sent complaints. The bureaucracy swelled, but the army thinned. Meanwhile, the world beyond Rome was changing at a terrifying pace. The Huns had swept across the steppes like wildfire, forcing waves of displaced peoples westward: Ostrogoths, Alans, Vandals, Suebi. Entire tribes moved not as raiders, but as nations, dragging wagons, elders, and children behind columns of warriors. They were not invading Rome. They were colliding with it. From the hills of Noricum to the forests of Gaul, Roman officials pleaded for reinforcements that would never come. Walls were patched, old forts were reoccupied. Veterans were called back to duty, many too old to carry their shields. Whole cities braced for war without knowing where the first blow would fall. but the people sensed it. Something ancient was ending. In Ravenna, Milan, and Constantinople, the streets were still swept, the laws still read aloud in forums, the priests still chanted their hymns. But beneath it all, a hush was spreading, the hush that comes before collapse. The eagle still flew, but it was weary. Across the fading borders of the Roman world, soldiers still stood watch. Some were stationed on wind-swept towers above the Rhine, their cloaks stiff with frost, eyes narrowed against the dark forests where hostile eyes sometimes glimmered. Others patrolled sun-scorched roads in the African provinces, where desert winds carried more silence than threat, but silence was often its own warning. In Illyricum, Moesia, and Pannonia, regions that span today's Balkans, legionaries still drilled in muddy fields, oiled their weapons, and recited commands in Latin. Their formations were slower, their supplies thinner, but their discipline endured. Behind every routine march and every hardened glance, there grew a quiet unease. The centre was hollowing. Rome, the Rome they had sworn to, was no longer watching. They were not the legions of Scipio or Caesar. These men did not cross Rubicons or conquer distant provinces. They were garrisoned soldiers now, border keepers, tax enforcers, road guards, weary veterans with patched mail and uncertain wages. But they still bore the crest of the eagle. They still answered to Rome. Many were no longer Roman by blood. They hailed from Thrace, Gaul, Cappadocia, Armenia, or had once been enemies from Gothic or Sarmatian clans. Yet they had taken the oath, the sacramentum militare, to obey, to endure, and if necessary, to bleed for Rome. And bleed they had. They had bled at Adrianople, where entire legions were swallowed by fire and spear. They had bled on forgotten roads in Gaul, where small detachments died holding bridges no one would remember. They had bled while suppressing revolts, chasing bandits, or simply standing too long in the wrong province at the wrong time. They buried comrades in shallow graves with no trumpet calls or funeral rites. Their victories were rarely celebrated. Their sacrifices were rarely repaid. Yet they kept fighting, not for gold or glory, but out of a stubborn loyalty to a crumbling dream. A loyalty to the idea that, even in chaos, there was still Rome, the eternal fire, the law that ordered stars, the roads that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. So they stayed. They guarded walls while emperors changed names and capitals. They held outposts long after they were officially abandoned. They watched towns burn, rebuilt them, and watched them burn again. They trained the next cohort, even if that cohort spoke less Latin and more Gothic. Their pay came late, or not at all. Their children no longer knew Rome firsthand, yet still these men stood in ranks, backs straight beneath the weight of a forgotten empire. In Ravenna, Honorius sat in isolation, a boy emperor protected more by swamps than armies. In Constantinople, Arcadius had already died, leaving the east to court factions and palace whispers. Between them, the empire's limbs grew numb. Orders stopped flowing. Taxes slowed. Legions were moved, not for strategy, but for politics. The Limes Germanicus, once the bulwark of civilization, fell into disrepair. In Britain, entire provinces were left to fend for themselves. And in the Balkans, a Gothic general named Alaric, once an ally, now marched with impunity. Some Roman soldiers deserted. Others faded into the local populations. A few fought under new flags. But even as the institutions crumbled, a few held on. They etched Latin inscriptions into cracked stones. They trained their sons in Roman drills. They kept the fires burning in outposts whose names would be forgotten within a generation. These men, the last of the legions, became more than soldiers. They became memory. When the Western Empire finally fell in 476 CE, it did not end with an explosion, but with a long exhale. Yet, in that silence, the ghost of the Legion still marched. You could hear it in the clink of iron along a lonely road, in the pattern of boots on cold stone, in the distant bark of a centurion's command echoing through a misty valley. These were echoes, not of conquest, but of endurance. Because when the world forgets an empire, it is the soldiers who remember. The eagle had fallen, but in the hearts of those who had carried its weight, it never truly died.